Help me, please. I can't breathe. The words were strained, broken between shallow gasps, almost swallowed by the noise of late evening traffic. Nina Whitmore heard them before she saw him. She had just stepped out of the station entrance, her small suitcase rolling behind her, her eyes fixed on the digital clock above the platform doors. 10 minutes before the last train north. 10 minutes between the life she had been struggling to escape and the life she hoped she was finally about to begin. Help me, the voice came again, weaker this time. Nina turned. A man in a dark coat was leaning awkwardly against the brick wall near the curb, one hand gripping his chest, the other reaching blindly toward the ground. His movements were slow and uncoordinated, as though every breath required negotiation. The inhaler lay just inches from his fingers, unnoticed by everyone passing him. A young man in a business suit glanced at him briefly, hesitated, then continued walking. A woman holding a takeout bag slowed for half a second before deciding against involvement. Someone muttered, probably drunk, without even looking. The man slid lower against the wall, his shoulders losing strength. Help me, please. Nina stopped walking. Her watch read 10:07 p.m. The last train departed at 10:15. If she missed it, she would not reach Blackwood Estate until morning. Mrs. Dalloway's voice echoed clearly in her memory. Punctuality reflects character. But the sound of the man's breathing was wrong. Too tight, too shallow. The kind of breathing that did not wait politely for convenient timing. She took one step toward him, then stopped again. You cannot afford mistakes tonight. She tightened her grip on the suitcase handle, then the man's chest seized again, a harsh, dry wheeze breaking from his throat as he struggled for air that would not come. Nina released the suitcase. She knelt beside him. Sir, can you hear me? He nodded faintly, eyes unfocused. My inhaler, he rasped. Please. She picked it up immediately, placing it carefully into his trembling hand before gently guiding it toward his mouth. Slow breath, she said quietly. Don't rush it. Just breathe. He pressed the inhaler, drawing the medication into his lungs with visible effort. His shoulders shook slightly as he fought to steady himself. You're all right, Nina continued softly. Stay with me. Focus on breathing. Another wheeze, then another breath, slightly deeper. The city continued moving around them as though nothing unusual was happening. A cab pulled away from the curb. Someone laughed across the street. A group of college students passed by, their conversation bright and distant. No one stopped. Ambulance, the man whispered. I'm calling, Nina said. Her fingers moved quickly across her phone screen. The operator answered on the second ring. Yes, Nina said calmly. I need medical assistance outside South Station, Dartmouth Street entrance. Male, approximately 40 years old, severe asthma attack, difficulty breathing but conscious. She listened carefully, repeating instructions back to the dispatcher without raising her voice. Yes, I'm staying with him. She ended the call and returned her full attention to the man's breathing. Help is coming. He nodded weakly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city seemed distant now, softened by the urgency of a moment that required quiet concentration. Thank you. He managed between breaths. You can thank me later, she replied gently. Right now, just breathe. His eyes focused on her more clearly, as though anchoring himself to something steady. Thought I could make it to the car, he said. You almost did, Nina answered. Another breath, this one slightly stronger. Her watch read 10:12. 3 minutes. A train announcement echoed faintly through the station doors behind her. Final boarding call. Nina did not turn around. She remained kneeling on the cold pavement, one hand lightly supporting his shoulder to keep him upright. She remembered the breathing rhythm a nurse had once taught her mother. Follow my voice, she said. Just like that. His breathing began to lengthen gradually. You're doing fine, she added quietly. A car door slammed somewhere nearby. Footsteps passed. Someone paused briefly, curiosity overcoming indifference for a second or two. Before continuing on, sirens sounded in the distance. The man closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. You shouldn't miss something important, he said, voice still fragile. Nina allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile. I think this is the important thing. The sirens grew louder, turning onto the street with urgency but not panic. The ambulance pulled up along the curb. 2 paramedics stepped out quickly, their movements efficient and practiced. What do we have? One asked. Severe asthma attack, Nina replied. Inhaler administered once. breathing improving but still shallow. The paramedic nodded approvingly. You did the right thing staying with him. They helped the man onto a stretcher, securing oxygen over his face. As they lifted him, his hand reached briefly toward Nina's sleeve. Your name? He said quietly. Nina, she replied. Nina, thank you. You're going to be all right, she said. The ambulance doors closed. The vehicle disappeared into the late evening traffic, lights fading into the distance. Only then did Nina turn toward the station entrance. The platform doors stood closed. The digital board displayed the time, 10:16 p.m. She stood still for a moment, her suitcase beside her. The cold air pressing gently against her face. Nina picked up her suitcase again and walked forward. Nina spent the rest of that night in a plastic chair beneath the dull glow of a vending machine, her suitcase tucked close to her ankle, as if someone might quietly remove the last evidence that she was still moving forward. The station had emptied gradually after the final departure, leaving only the low hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional sound of a janitor's cart rolling across the polished floor. A digital display above the ticket counter shifted slowly from late evening schedules to early morning routes, marking the quiet passage of hours that no longer belonged to her original plan. She replayed the moment on the sidewalk more than once, not with regret exactly, but with the careful examination of someone measuring consequence. Missing the last train had not been part of the plan she had built so carefully over the past week. Plans mattered when money was limited. Plans mattered when one mistake could return everything to uncertainty. Yet when she pictured the man's face turning gray under the amber streetlight, the sound of his breath breaking unevenly in the cold air, she knew there had been no real choice to make. Some decisions presented themselves already decided. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. It's always powerful to see how far stories of quiet courage can travel. And if you support Nina, if you believe doing the right thing still matters, don't be shy. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stand with those who choose integrity even when the road becomes harder. At 4:30 inches the morning, the first commuter train toward Weston finally opened its doors. Nina boarded quietly, choosing a window seat near the middle of the car. Outside, the sky remained a deep shade of blue-gray, the kind of color that belonged neither to night nor morning. She rested her forehead briefly against the cool glass, allowing her eyes to close for just a moment. The exhaustion she felt was not dramatic or overwhelming. It was steady, familiar, the result of years of adjusting expectations without allowing disappointment to linger too long. The train moved north through neighborhoods, slowly waking to another ordinary weekday. Rows of modest houses appeared between stretches of trees losing their final leaves. A man in a heavy coat walked a golden retriever along a narrow sidewalk. A bakery switched on its lights before sunrise, the glow warm against the quiet street. Nina watched these small details without really seeing them. Her thoughts already focused on the hours ahead. She checked her watch, still 2 minutes slow. The address folded in her pocket seemed heavier now, not because the paper had changed, but because arriving late carried meaning she could not easily explain away. First impressions shaped expectations. Expectations shaped opportunity. Mrs. Dalloway had not sounded like a woman inclined toward flexible interpretations of professionalism. By the time the train reached Weston, the sun had risen enough to soften the sharpness of the cold air. Nina stepped onto the platform and pulled her coat tighter, scanning the nearly empty station for directions. A bus route connected to Blackwood Lane, followed by a short walk through a residential road lined with tall maple trees, whose branches formed a quiet arch overhead. Fallen leaves collected along the curb, dry and fragile beneath her shoes. Blackwood Estate appeared gradually behind a tall, wrought-iron gate set back from the road. The property extended farther than she expected, the long gravel drive curving gently toward a large stone house partially hidden by trees. The building did not display extravagance loudly. It suggested permanence instead. Dark wood shutters framed tall windows. Ivy climbed along one side of the exterior wall. Everything about the place communicated discipline, history, and a preference for privacy. A security camera followed her movement as she approached the gate. Moments later, the gate opened automatically with a soft mechanical sound. Nina walked slowly along the drive, her suitcase wheels crunching lightly against the gravel. The air smelled faintly of pine and distant rain. Somewhere nearby, a groundskeeper adjusted the direction of a water hose, nodding politely without curiosity. People here seemed accustomed to quiet arrivals. The front entrance opened before she reached the steps. A woman in her early 60s stood waiting just inside, posture straight, hands folded calmly at her waist. Mrs. Dalloway appeared exactly as her voice had suggested during their phone conversation. Composed, observant, precise. "You must be Miss Whitmore," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Good morning." Mrs. Dalloway's eyes moved briefly from Nina's face to her suitcase, then to her watch, then back again. The examination was not rude, merely thorough. "You were expected at 8, she said calmly. "Yes, ma'am," Nina answered. "I apologize. There was an unexpected situation last night that delayed my arrival." Mrs. Dalloway did not ask for details. Her expression suggested that explanations belonged in categories she preferred not to explore unless necessary. "Punctuality reflects reliability," she replied. "Reliability builds trust. Trust determines longevity in a household such as this one." "I understand." Mrs. Dalloway stepped aside, allowing Nina to enter the foyer. The interior smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh linen. Morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating a staircase that curved upward with understated elegance. The house felt quiet in a way that suggested order rather than emptiness. "You will begin with orientation," Mrs. Dalloway continued, walking ahead at a measured pace. "The expectations here are straightforward. Discretion is essential. Consistency is valued. Initiative is noticed, though not always rewarded immediately." They passed through a corridor lined with framed photographs of landscapes, most taken in winter. Snow-covered trees, frozen lakes, empty fields beneath pale skies. "Breakfast service begins at 6:30, Mrs. Dalloway said. "The household operates according to established rhythms. Deviations are rare and generally unwelcome." "Yes, ma'am. You will be responsible initially for second-floor guest rooms, linen inventory, and assisting senior staff when requested. Efficiency matters more than speed. Precision matters more than effort." Nina listened carefully, committing each instruction to memory without interrupting. Mrs. Dalloway paused beside a narrow table where several neatly folded pairs of white gloves rested in a small wooden tray. "You will wear these during service hours," she said. "Presentation communicates respect for the environment in which one works." Nina accepted the gloves, noting the careful stitching along the seams. Small details carried meaning here. As they continued through the hallway, distant voices echoed softly from the kitchen area. Staff members moved with quiet coordination, each aware of the other's timing. No one rushed unnecessarily. No one appeared idle. "The employer is currently unavailable," Mrs. Dalloway added. "You are not expected to interact with him directly, without instruction." Nina nodded. "Mr. Volkov values professionalism," Mrs. Dalloway continued. "He also values loyalty. Both qualities require demonstration rather than declaration." The name registered faintly in Nina's mind, though she could not immediately place it. It sounded familiar in the vague way certain names appeared occasionally in news articles or conversations overheard in waiting rooms. Mrs. Dalloway stopped beside a doorway leading to a modest staff room furnished with a long wooden table and neatly arranged chairs. "You may leave your belongings here," she said. "We begin in 5 minutes." Nina placed her suitcase carefully against the wall, smoothing the sleeve of her coat before putting on the white gloves. The fabric felt unfamiliar at first, a reminder that entering a new environment required adjustment not only of behavior but of expectation. From the window beside the table, she could see the curve of the gravel driveway disappearing between rows of trees. Somewhere beyond those trees lay the city she had left only hours ago, the platform where one train had departed without her. Mrs. Dalloway returned to the doorway. "One more thing," she said. "In this household, we do not dwell on inconvenience. We correct course and proceed." "Yes, ma'am." Nina straightened slightly. "I will proceed." By the afternoon of her first day, Nina understood that Blackwood Estate did not operate like a normal household. Every movement carried intention. Every instruction contained a quiet expectation of perfection. Even the silence seemed structured, as though the house itself required discipline from the people inside it. She worked beside 2 other housemaids, Margaret and Elise, both older, both efficient in the calm, practiced way of women who had spent years mastering environments that rewarded invisibility. Margaret had worked in private homes across Massachusetts for more than 2 decades. Elise had once been a hotel supervisor before deciding she preferred the predictability of residential service. First day is always the longest, Margaret said gently as they folded freshly pressed linens in the second-floor laundry room. You try to remember everything at once. Best not to rush that process. I won't, Nina replied. Margaret nodded approvingly. Mrs. Dalloway values steadiness more than speed. That works in your favor. The laundry room window overlooked the back gardens, where a stone pathway curved toward a line of tall hedges separating the estate from neighboring properties. The air carried the faint scent of pine mixed with the subtle warmth of heated fabric. Nina folded each sheet carefully, aligning the corners precisely the way Elise demonstrated. Do we see the owner often? Nina asked after a moment. Margaret gave a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Rarely. Mr. Volkov prefers privacy. You'll find most instructions come through Mrs. Dalloway or Mr. Reeves. Mr. Reeves? Personal assistant. Handles schedules. Keeps everything moving without interruption. Elise added quietly. You'll notice security more than you notice him. Nina absorbed the information without pressing further. In houses like this, curiosity often created unnecessary complications. They completed the linen inventory before moving to the guest wing, where tall windows allowed late afternoon light to stretch across polished wooden floors. Nina noticed small details as she worked. Books arranged by height rather than subject. Framed photographs turned slightly inward. Surfaces kept free of clutter, yet not entirely empty. Someone here preferred order that did not advertise itself. By early evening, the staff gathered briefly in the service kitchen for a short meal. The space was warm, simple, functional. A pot of vegetable soup rested near the stove beside a tray of bread that had been sliced evenly. Margaret poured Nina a cup of tea. Long commute? She asked. From Ohio originally, Nina replied. Today from Boston. That's a change. Yes. Margaret stirred her tea slowly. Most people arrive here expecting something impressive. They usually discover something quiet instead. Nina considered that. What kind of quiet? The kind that listens, Margaret said. No one elaborated. Later, while organizing cleaning supplies in a narrow hallway cabinet, Nina noticed a television screen mounted discreetly above a shelf in the staff common room. The volume was low, subtitles running beneath the evening news broadcast. Philanthropic donations supporting expansion of respiratory treatment programs, the reporter said. A photograph appeared briefly on the screen, showing a man standing beside a hospital director. The image disappeared quickly as the segment shifted to another topic. Nina did not think much of it at the time. Mrs. Dalloway assigned Nina to prepare a rarely used study on the second floor before the end of her shift. The room remained dim even with the overhead light switched on, dark wood shelves lining the walls from floor to ceiling. Books filled every available space, arranged with careful symmetry. A large desk stood near the window, its surface nearly empty except for a leather folder and a glass of water that had not been touched. Nina moved quietly, dusting each shelf methodically. One framed photograph stood slightly apart from the others, placed face down beside a reading lamp. She did not lift it. Some objects communicated boundaries clearly without requiring explanation. Her attention shifted instead to the window overlooking the driveway. Twilight had begun settling over the property, softening the outlines of the trees. A security vehicle moved slowly along the perimeter road before disappearing behind the hedges. The house seemed to breathe differently at night. Activity slowed but never fully stopped. As she finished arranging the room, footsteps approached along the hallway outside. Nina stepped back from the desk, instinctively allowing space for whoever might enter. The door opened halfway. Mrs. Dalloway stood in the doorway, her expression unchanged but her posture slightly more formal than earlier. You may finish for today, she said. Yes, ma'am. There will be additional responsibilities tomorrow morning. Mr. Volkov is expected to return sooner than previously scheduled. Nina nodded politely. Understood. Mrs. Dalloway hesitated briefly, as though considering whether additional explanation was necessary. He experienced a medical incident yesterday evening, she said calmly. He is recovering. Discretion regarding household matters remains essential. Yes, ma'am. Nina felt a faint pause somewhere in her thoughts, a subtle connection forming without yet becoming clear. Medical incident. Yesterday evening. Boston. She did not speak. Mrs. Dalloway observed her for a moment longer before continuing. In this household, we respond to circumstance without dramatization. Stability is maintained through composure. I understand. Good. Mrs. Dalloway inclined her head slightly and stepped away down the corridor. Nina removed the white gloves carefully, folding them together before placing them inside the supply drawer. Her hands felt lighter without them, though the impression of their presence remained. As she collected her bag from the staff room, Margaret offered a small gesture toward the door. "You did well today," she said. "Thank you. Rest matters. Tomorrow will require attention." Nina stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sky above the estate had darkened to deep blue, stars beginning to appear faintly beyond the tree line. The gravel drive reflected the soft glow of exterior lights placed carefully along the path. She paused briefly near the gate before beginning the short walk toward the nearby staff residence arranged temporarily for new employees. Her body carried the quiet fatigue of effort sustained over many hours, but her thoughts remained steady. The image of the man on the sidewalk returned unexpectedly, the sound of his voice strained and urgent. "Help me. I can't breathe." She wondered whether he had reached the hospital in time. She wondered whether someone had been waiting for him. She wondered whether he had family who understood how close the distance between ordinary moments and irreversible ones could sometimes be. Nina checked her watch. Still 2 minutes slow. She adjusted the strap slightly before continuing down the path. Somewhere inside the large house behind her, preparations had already begun for the return of a man she had not yet met. And without realizing it, Nina had already changed the direction of his life. Morning arrived quietly at Blackwood Estate, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty but carefully maintained. Nina woke before her alarm, her body still adjusting to unfamiliar surroundings, the rhythm of a new routine already forming in the background of her thoughts. The small staff residence sat just beyond the main gardens, modest but comfortable, with cream-colored walls and a narrow window that faced east. Pale sunlight filtered through thin curtains, bringing with it the faint smell of damp leaves and early autumn air. She dressed with deliberate care, pressing the collar of her plain white blouse with her hands before fastening the final button. The wristwatch still ran 2 minutes slow. She noticed it again, as she always did, and for a brief moment considered adjusting it. She did not. Some imperfections served as reminders of continuity. In the staff kitchen, Margaret was already preparing coffee. The room smelled warm and familiar, a small comfort before the day's expectations began unfolding. A radio played softly near the window, a morning news segment blending gently with the quiet clink of ceramic cups. "You're early," Margaret said without looking up. "I wanted to be," Nina replied. Margaret poured coffee into a plain mug and handed it to her. Good instinct. They sat for a moment without speaking. Outside, the estate grounds carried the muted sounds of preparation. Somewhere in the distance, gravel shifted beneath tires. "Mr. Volkov arrives today," Margaret said finally. "So I heard." Margaret nodded once. "Routine changes slightly when he is present. Nothing dramatic, just more attention to detail." "I understand." Margaret studied her briefly. "You'll likely assist in the West Wing this morning. Mrs. Dalloway prefers everything exact before his return." The phrase "before his return" lingered in Nina's mind. She did not know why. By 7 a.m., activity had increased throughout the main house. Staff moved efficiently but quietly, exchanging brief nods rather than conversation. Fresh flowers appeared in tall glass vases along the entry hall. A polished tray rested near the staircase, holding correspondence arranged with careful symmetry. Even the air seemed more alert. Mrs. Dalloway reviewed the morning assignments with calm precision. "Nina, you will assist with preparation of the upstairs office corridor. Dusting, alignment of furnishings, verification of supplies. Nothing complicated, only thorough." "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Reeves will conduct a short inspection prior to Mr. Volkov's arrival." Nina inclined her head slightly. The upstairs corridor remained softly lit despite the clear morning outside. Tall windows allowed natural light to reach the polished floors, revealing faint reflections that showed whether surfaces had been properly maintained. Nina moved slowly, adjusting the placement of a chair by less than an inch after noticing the angle differed slightly from the symmetrical arrangement across the hall. Details mattered here in ways that did not require explanation. As she finished aligning the last side table, footsteps approached with measured pace. A man in his early 30s entered the corridor, carrying a slim tablet in one hand. His suit was understated, his expression attentive without appearing severe. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes, I'm Thomas Reeves." His voice carried calm authority, the kind that did not need to announce itself. "Mrs. Dalloway mentioned you joined us yesterday." "Yes, sir." He nodded politely. "Welcome to Blackwood Estate." Thank you. Thomas glanced briefly around the corridor, noticing the arrangement of the furniture, the placement of the flowers, the alignment of the framed artwork. Good work, he said simply. Nina acknowledged the comment with a small nod. Mr. Volkov will be arriving shortly, Thomas continued. There may be minor schedule adjustments throughout the day. Continue with assigned tasks unless instructed otherwise. Yes, sir. Thomas paused for a moment, as though considering something further. Yesterday evening was eventful, he said carefully. Nina did not respond immediately. He did not elaborate. Carry on, he added, before continuing down the corridor. His presence left behind a subtle awareness that information moved differently inside this house. Near midday, the low sound of a vehicle entering the gravel drive echoed faintly through the structure. The shift in atmosphere was almost imperceptible, yet every staff member seemed to register it at the same moment. Margaret passed Nina in the hallway. He's here, she said quietly. Nina did not realize she had paused in her work until Margaret's words reached her. A dark sedan stopped near the front entrance. Through the tall window at the end of the corridor, Nina caught only a partial glimpse of movement near the steps. A tall figure exited the vehicle slowly, accompanied by Thomas and a second man who appeared to be part of security staff. The distance prevented clear detail, but something about the posture felt familiar. Controlled movement, measured pace. Someone recovering strength carefully. Nina returned her attention to the linen cabinet she had been organizing. Order offered stability. Moments later, Mrs. Dalloway appeared beside her. Mr. Volkov will be working from the West office today, she said. No interruption unless requested. Yes, ma'am. The study you prepared yesterday will require minor adjustment. Fresh water on the desk. Replace the glass. I will take care of it. Mrs. Dalloway observed her briefly, then inclined her head. Efficiency is appreciated. Inside the study, the air felt slightly cooler than the rest of the house. Nina replaced the glass of water carefully, ensuring no marks remained on the polished wood surface. The leather folder on the desk remained undisturbed, positioned at a precise angle that suggested intentional placement. She adjusted the curtains slightly to allow a softer balance of natural light. Footsteps approached behind her. She stepped aside instinctively. A quiet voice spoke from the doorway. That will be fine. Nina turned. For a moment, time seemed to hesitate. The man standing there was no longer struggling for breath beneath a city streetlight. He stood composed, dressed in a charcoal suit, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe as though measuring the distance between effort and recovery. Alexander Volkov. His gaze met hers with calm recognition. No surprise, only certainty. You were at South Station, he said. The words were not accusatory. They were factual. Nina did not attempt denial. Yes. A brief silence followed. Not uncomfortable, but deliberate. You helped me breathe, he continued. Yes. His expression remained steady, thoughtful rather than emotional. You missed your train. Yes. Another pause. I imagine that was inconvenient. Nina considered the question carefully. Yes, she answered. It was. Something almost resembling approval moved briefly across his expression. I prefer accuracy, he said. I try to provide it. He studied her for a moment longer. Thank you, he said simply. You're welcome. No dramatic gestures, no prolonged conversation, just acknowledgement. He stepped past her into the study. You may return to your duties, he added. Yes, sir. As Nina walked back into the corridor, she became aware of her own breathing, steady and calm, the same breathing rhythm she had guided only hours earlier beneath the cold city lights. Somewhere behind her, a door closed quietly, and the balance of her new life shifted almost imperceptibly into place. The house felt different after the meeting in the study. Though no one mentioned it directly, Nina returned to the linen room with the same measured pace she had maintained all morning, yet something subtle had shifted beneath the surface of routine. Encounters with employers were usually distant, brief, often formal enough to leave little impression beyond instruction. This interaction had been neither distant nor formal in the usual sense. It had been quiet, deliberate, almost reflective. Margaret glanced up from a basket of folded towels as Nina entered. All well? She asked casually. Yes, Nina replied. Margaret waited, sensing there was more to the answer, but she did not press. Experience had taught her that information arrived in its own time. Mr. Volkov rarely speaks more than necessary, Margaret said after a moment. If he spoke, he likely had reason. He thanked me. Nina said simply. Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her tone remained calm. That is not common. Nina resumed organizing the linen shelves, aligning stacks carefully. She felt no desire to elaborate further. The exchange had been private in a way that did not invite repetition. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Dalloway called for Nina in the west corridor. "You will assist with document arrangement in the office suite," she said. "Temporary assignment." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Dalloway handed her a small stack of folders labeled only by date. "These are to be placed in chronological order on the side table inside the conference room. Mr. Reeves will review them later." Nina accepted the folders and walked toward the office wing. The space differed from the residential areas of the house. The atmosphere felt more structured, less personal. Dark wood paneling softened the walls, while subtle recessed lighting provided clarity without harshness. The conference room door stood partially open. Inside, a long table stretched across the center of the room, its polished surface reflecting muted light from a single window overlooking the back gardens. Nina arranged the folders carefully, noting that each document bore the name of a foundation associated with medical or educational funding. Several referenced respiratory research initiatives. She paused briefly at one heading, Volkov Foundation, Pulmonary Care Expansion Grant. The words lingered in her thoughts. Behind her, a quiet voice spoke. "You read carefully." She turned. Thomas Reeves stood in the doorway, tablet in hand, observing without intrusion. "I try not to disturb order," Nina replied. Thomas nodded slightly. "That is often appreciated." He stepped into the room, reviewing the arrangement of the folders. "Accuracy matters more than speed here," he said. "Yes, sir." Thomas glanced at her briefly, then back at the documents. "Mr. Volkov's schedule has adjusted significantly in recent years," he continued. "Philanthropic commitments require patience." Nina did not comment, but the earlier news segment she had seen in the staff room returned faintly to mind. Thomas closed the final folder. "You may return to your assigned duties," he said. "Thank you." As Nina walked back toward the residential corridor, she noticed subtle differences in how staff members interacted with her. No overt change, no direct acknowledgement, yet something had shifted in posture, in tone, in the brief glances exchanged when her name was mentioned. Margaret approached her near the service stairs. "Mr. Reeves spoke with you?" "Yes." Margaret gave a thoughtful nod. "That usually means something." "I am still learning what everything means here," Nina said. Margaret smiled gently. "That is wise." The remainder of the afternoon passed without interruption. Nina assisted Elise with inventory checks in the guest wing, ensuring that each room contained identical arrangements of folded towels, neatly aligned toiletries, and carefully pressed bedding. Precision created predictability. Predictability created calm. Near sunset, a subtle tension moved through the house again, though less pronounced than earlier. Thomas passed quickly through the hallway carrying a thin file. A security officer spoke quietly into an earpiece before stepping outside toward the driveway. In the staff kitchen, the evening news played again at low volume. Anonymous donor funding, expansion of respiratory clinics in rural communities. Margaret lowered the volume slightly, focusing on preparing tea. "Generous people rarely discuss generosity publicly," she remarked. Elise nodded in agreement. Nina listened without appearing to listen. As the evening duties concluded, Mrs. Dalloway approached Nina once more. "Your work today has been satisfactory," she said. "Thank you, ma'am. Consistency over time determines placement within the household structure." "I understand." Mrs. Dalloway studied her briefly. "Mr. Volkov appreciates competence," she added. Nina inclined her head slightly. "I appreciate the opportunity." Mrs. Dalloway seemed almost satisfied with that response. "Report at 7 tomorrow morning," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Outside, the air carried the scent of wood smoke from a distant chimney. Nina walked slowly along the gravel path toward the staff residence. The sky above deepening into evening blue. The events of the past 24 hours moved through her thoughts without urgency. Some moments required time before revealing their full meaning. Inside the residence, she removed her shoes carefully, placing them beside the door with quiet habit. She sat briefly at the small wooden desk near the window and opened her notebook. Her handwriting remained neat despite the fatigue she felt in her hands. Day 1 completed. Unexpected beginning. She paused before adding another line. Kindness has consequences. She closed the notebook and glanced at her watch. Still 2 minutes slow. For the first time since arriving, she considered adjusting it. Then she left it unchanged, Some things did not need correction. They needed understanding. The second morning began with rain. A quiet, steady rain that settled over Blackwood Estate without wind, without urgency, as if the sky itself had chosen patience. Nina noticed the sound first while buttoning her blouse, the soft tapping against the window of the staff residence forming a rhythm that felt almost familiar. Rain had always reminded her of Ohio mornings when her mother would wake early to prepare coffee before work, the scent filling their small apartment long before sunrise. She arrived in the main house 5 minutes early, the gravel path darker now beneath the thin sheen of water. Inside, the air felt warmer than the day before, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and something herbal drifting from the kitchen. Margaret stood near the counter arranging a tray of sliced fruit. "Rain makes everything quieter," she said without turning. "Yes," Nina replied. Margaret poured tea into 2 cups. "People move differently when it rains. Slower, more carefully. Houses notice these things." Nina accepted the cup. "Does the schedule change today?" Margaret considered the question. "Mr. Volkov's physician advised reduced meetings this week," she said. "Less travel, more time here." That information lingered briefly. "Recovery requires adjustment," Margaret added. At precisely 7, Mrs. Dalloway entered the kitchen with a folded list in her hand. "Mr. Volkov will remain in residence for the majority of the day," she said. Staff assignments adjusted accordingly. Her eyes moved briefly toward Nina. "You will assist with office preparation again this morning." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Dalloway handed her a small key card. Access to the upper study corridor. Mr. Reeves requested document organization prior to 9. Nina accepted the card. The rain softened further as she walked through the east hallway, the muted light creating reflections across the polished floor. The house seemed to absorb sound differently today, footsteps fading more quickly into silence. Inside the study corridor, a faint scent of leather and paper lingered, suggesting hours spent working rather than decorating. Nina arranged the desk surface carefully, ensuring the water glass remained aligned with the edge of the leather folder. Small adjustments made quiet differences. A soft knock sounded behind her. "You're precise," Thomas Reeves said from the doorway. "I try to be consistent," Nina replied. Thomas stepped inside, reviewing the desk without touching anything. "Consistency allows trust to develop," he said. Nina nodded slightly. Thomas paused, then spoke with measured calm. "Mr. Volkov prefers reliability in the people around him. Predictability allows him to focus on larger decisions." "Understood." Thomas placed a thin folder on the desk. "These documents require no action from you, only placement." Nina positioned the folder exactly where indicated. Thomas observed her for a moment longer than necessary, as though evaluating something beyond the task itself. "Yesterday evening," he said, "Mr. Volkov asked about your commute." Nina looked at him briefly. "I told him the truth. That is usually effective." Thomas allowed the smallest trace of approval to appear before returning his attention to the tablet in his hand. "He values direct answers," Thomas continued. "So do I." Thomas gave a quiet nod. A few minutes later, footsteps approached again from the far end of the corridor. Slower this time, controlled. Alexander Volkov entered the study without hurry, dressed simply in a dark sweater rather than a formal jacket. The difference in attire altered his presence slightly, making him appear less distant, though no less composed. "You're early," he said. "I prefer to be prepared," Nina answered. "That is useful." His voice remained calm, but the faint strain of recent illness remained visible in the careful rhythm of his breathing. He crossed the room slowly, pausing briefly beside the desk. "Doctor insists I work less," he said quietly. "That sounds reasonable." He looked at her, the corner of his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. "Most people do not answer that honestly. Health rarely improves by ignoring it." He seemed to consider that. "You speak carefully," he observed. "I speak truthfully." Volkov rested one hand lightly against the back of the chair. "Yesterday," he said, "you did not hesitate." Nina understood immediately what he meant. "No. You had somewhere important to be." "Yes. And still you stopped." "Yes." A brief silence followed, the sound of rain faint against the window. "Why?" The question carried no pressure, only curiosity. Nina considered her answer carefully. "Because not stopping would have stayed with me longer than missing a train." Volkov studied her expression, not searching for embellishment, only confirmation. "Most people calculate differently," he said. "Most people are tired," Nina replied. Something thoughtful passed through his gaze. Tired people often protect themselves first. Sometimes that protection costs more. He did not respond immediately. Rain traced thin paths down the glass behind him, distorting the reflection of the garden. "You guided my breathing," he said. "It was instinct. Instinct is rarely accidental." Nina did not answer. Volkov straightened slightly, though the movement remained measured. "You may continue your work," he said. "Yes, sir." As he turned toward the desk, he paused once more. "You kept the inhaler steady," he added. "Yes. That matters." He did not elaborate. Nina returned to the corridor quietly, aware that the conversation had contained more meaning than words alone suggested. Margaret met her near the service stairs. "Everything in order?" she asked. "Yes." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Mr. Volkov rarely repeats conversations," she said. "If he spoke again today, he intends something." Nina considered that. "I intend to continue working," she replied. Margaret smiled softly. That is usually the correct response. The remainder of the morning passed with quiet efficiency. Nina assisted Elise in preparing the west guest room, replacing fresh towels and adjusting the curtains to allow filtered light to soften the interior space. At midday, Thomas moved quickly through the hallway again, speaking briefly with Mrs. Dalloway near the staircase. Their conversation remained too quiet to overhear, but the exchange appeared purposeful. Later, Nina found a small envelope placed neatly on the staff desk beside the inventory ledger. Inside was a printed schedule adjustment. Additional responsibilities beginning next week. No explanation attached. Margaret noticed her reading it. "Change arrives gradually here," she said. Nina folded the paper carefully. "I can adapt." Margaret poured tea into 2 cups. "Adaptation is easier when character is steady," she said. Nina looked briefly at her watch. Still 2 minutes slow. The rain had begun to fade outside, leaving the air clean and sharp with the scent of wet leaves. Somewhere in the house, decisions were being made quietly, and without realizing it fully, Nina had already become part of them. On the 3rd morning, the house seemed to wake before the sun. Nina noticed it immediately when she stepped inside the main hallway. The atmosphere carried a quiet alertness, subtle but unmistakable, as though the rhythm of the household had shifted slightly ahead of schedule. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished oak, the 2 scents blending into something steady and reassuring. Margaret was already reviewing a clipboard near the service kitchen door. "You'll be assisting in the West office again today," she said, offering Nina a small nod. Mr. Reeves requested additional preparation. Nina accepted the information calmly. "Understood." Margaret studied her for a moment, then added gently, "The house adjusts to people more than people realize." Nina considered that as she tied her hair neatly at the nape of her neck. "I will adjust with it." Margaret smiled quietly. "That is often enough." The west corridor appeared brighter today, sunlight filtering through tall windows after the previous day's rain had washed the sky clear. The polished floors reflected the light in soft patterns that shifted as clouds passed slowly overhead. Inside the study, Nina began by reviewing the desk placement once more, ensuring that the edges of each folder aligned with precise symmetry. The leather chair remained slightly angled toward the window, suggesting recent use. As she replaced the water glass with fresh water, she noticed something new, a small metal inhaler resting near the corner of the desk. The sight stopped her movement for only a fraction of a second. He had placed it within reach, not hidden, not ignored, acknowledged. She finished arranging the desk without touching the inhaler. Footsteps approached quietly behind her. "Good morning," Alexander Volkov said. "Good morning, sir." He moved into the room slowly, the measured pace of someone still regaining full strength. The morning light revealed faint shadows beneath his eyes, subtle signs that recovery was not yet complete. "You arrive early," he observed. "I prefer not to rush." "That is efficient." He glanced briefly toward the inhaler, then back to the documents on the desk. "Doctor recommends patience," he said calmly. "Patience has never been a natural skill. It can be learned." He allowed the smallest trace of acknowledgement to appear in his expression. "You speak as though you have practiced." "I have." Volkov sat carefully in the chair, reviewing the top document without immediately reading it. "Mr. Reeves tells me you worked in hospitality before this position," he said. "Yes." "Hotels?" "Yes." "What did you learn there?" Nina considered her answer. "That people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe no one is paying attention." He looked at her more directly now. "And what do people usually reveal?" "Pressure," she said. fear, sometimes kindness. And which do you trust most? Kindness that appears under pressure. Volkov studied her quietly for a moment. That is rare. Yes. He nodded slightly, then shifted his attention back to the papers. You may continue with your tasks, he said. Yes, sir. As Nina turned toward the door, he spoke again. You noticed the inhaler? Yes. You did not move it. It was placed intentionally. That is correct. A brief pause followed. Thank you, he said. For what? For not assuming ownership of something that is not yours to manage. She inclined her head politely. I respect boundaries. That is useful. In the corridor, Thomas Reeves waited near the window, reviewing his tablet. Everything satisfactory? He asked without looking up. Yes. Thomas made a small note on the screen. Mr. Volkov rarely invites conversation in the morning, he said. If he does, it usually indicates evaluation. I focus on the work. That is wise. Thomas paused, then added in a quieter tone. Trust develops slowly here. But once established, it tends to remain. Nina nodded once. Margaret met her later in the linen room, placing freshly pressed pillowcases into neat stacks. You've been reassigned temporarily, she said. Yes. Margaret folded the final pillowcase carefully. Temporary arrangements sometimes become permanent. I will continue learning. Margaret's eyes softened slightly. That is exactly what Mrs. Dalloway likes to hear. By midday, the house had settled into its familiar rhythm once more. The sound of quiet footsteps moved along the upper hallway. Distant voices remained low and measured, and sunlight warmed the tall windows, overlooking the gardens. While organizing supply inventory, Nina noticed Mrs. Dalloway speaking privately with Thomas near the staircase. Their conversation was brief but purposeful. Mrs. Dalloway approached Nina shortly afterward. You will assist with correspondence preparation this afternoon, she said. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Volkov values accuracy in written communication. Files must remain in chronological order. I understand. Mrs. Dalloway paused slightly. You have adapted quickly. I try to remain consistent. Consistency creates predictability, Mrs. Dalloway said. Predictability allows trust. The same word again, trust. It appeared frequently in this house, rarely explained but always implied. Later, while placing envelopes in precise alignment on the side table in the office suite, Nina noticed the faint reflection of movement in the glass cabinet beside her. Alexander Volkov stood just beyond the doorway, reviewing a document with Thomas. You reviewed the security report? Thomas asked quietly. Yes, Volkov replied. And? A predictable outcome. Thomas inclined his head slightly. No further action? Observation first. The conversation ended as they moved further down the corridor. Nina did not react outwardly. Observation first. The phrase remained with her. That evening, as she returned to the staff residence, the sky had cleared completely. The air carried a crisp stillness that often arrived after rain had washed the dust from the world. She removed her watch briefly, turning it gently in her hand. 2 minutes slow. Still, she fastened it back into place. Not everything required immediate correction. Some things revealed their purpose only after time had passed. Inside the main house behind her, lights glowed steadily in the west office. And quietly, without announcement, Nina's presence had begun to influence decisions made at a level she could not yet fully see. The invitation did not arrive dramatically. It appeared quietly, placed beside the morning inventory ledger in the staff office, printed on simple cream paper without ornament or signature. Nina noticed it only after she had finished recording the linen count for the second-floor guest rooms. Mr. Volkov requests your presence in the West Study at 4:30 p.m. No explanation followed. No instruction beyond the time. She read the sentence twice before folding the paper carefully and placing it inside her notebook. Margaret noticed the motion but did not ask immediately. Experience had taught her that questions often became unnecessary when answers revealed themselves in sequence. Schedule change? Margaret asked after a moment. Yes. Margaret nodded, her expression calm but attentive. That happens. Nina continued her work as usual. Precision remained the safest response to uncertainty. Towels aligned evenly along the shelf. Glass surfaces polished until reflections appeared clear without distortion. Every movement deliberate, unhurried. At noon, Mrs. Dalloway reviewed the afternoon assignments with her usual composed tone. You will conclude your duties early today, she said. At 4:15, proceed to the West Study corridor. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Dalloway observed her briefly. Professional composure is appreciated regardless of circumstance. I understand. Margaret placed a small cup of tea beside Nina's notebook later that afternoon. Private meetings are not common, she said gently. I will listen carefully. Margaret allowed herself the faintest smile. That is usually sufficient. By 4:20 p.m., the house had grown unusually quiet. Even the subtle rhythm of daily activity seemed softened, as though the structure itself recognized the significance of moments that required privacy. Nina adjusted the cuff of her blouse once before walking toward the west corridor. Her footsteps remained steady against the polished floor, her breathing calm. She had spent years learning how to enter unfamiliar rooms without carrying uncertainty visibly. Thomas Reeves stood outside the study door when she arrived. Miss Whitmore, he said politely. Mr. Reeves, he will see you now. Thomas opened the door but did not enter. The gesture made clear that this conversation did not require witnesses. The study felt warmer than usual, late afternoon light resting across the desk in long amber lines. Alexander Volkov stood near the window, one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair as he had done previously, though today his posture appeared stronger. Thank you for coming, he said. Of course. He gestured toward the chair opposite the desk. Please sit. Nina sat without hesitation, placing her hands calmly in her lap. Volkov remained standing for a moment, as though choosing his words carefully. When you helped me outside the station, he said, you did not ask questions. No. You did not hesitate. No. You did not know who I was. No. He moved slowly toward the desk, resting his fingertips lightly against its surface. Many people hesitate when uncertainty is involved, he continued, particularly when involvement carries risk. Yes. You accepted inconvenience. Yes. You accepted potential loss. Yes. A quiet pause followed. Why? Nina answered without rushing. Because breathing is not optional. Volkov studied her expression as though confirming that the simplicity of the answer was genuine. You believed I could have been dangerous. Yes. You still stayed. Yes. He nodded once, as though confirming a calculation already completed. I have spent many years observing people, he said. Most demonstrate character when circumstances are favorable. Fewer maintain it when conditions become difficult. He walked toward the window briefly, looking out across the gardens. In my previous life, he continued carefully, trust was often transactional. Loyalty was frequently temporary. He turned back toward her. That creates inefficiency. Nina listened without interruption. I no longer operate in that environment, he said calmly, but memory remains useful. Yes. I asked Mr. Reeves to review the circumstances surrounding Tuesday evening, he continued. Timeline verification. Security footage from nearby buildings. Emergency response confirmation. Nina did not react visibly. The sequence aligns with your account. Yes. You arrived late for your first day because you prevented a stranger from suffocating alone. Yes. Volkov nodded once more. That indicates prioritization. He opened a folder on the desk and removed a single document. This position requires more than technical skill, he said. It requires judgment. He placed the document on the desk between them. I am restructuring certain responsibilities within the household. Nina remained still. The role of personal house manager requires discretion, consistency, and independent decision-making. He allowed the words to settle before continuing. I believe you are suited to that responsibility. Nina did not respond immediately. You are offering a promotion, she said finally. Yes. After 3 days. Yes. That is unusual. Yes. She considered the document without touching it. What changed your decision? She asked. Volkov answered simply. You did not change when circumstances became inconvenient. Silence settled briefly between them. This is not charity, he added. It is efficiency. I understand. The salary reflects expanded responsibility, he continued. Health insurance coverage included immediately. Nina's gaze remained steady. My mother requires medical treatment, she said. I am aware. She did not ask how. The position requires confidentiality, he said. That is reasonable. You will oversee coordination between domestic staff and administrative scheduling. Yes. You will report directly to Mr. Reeves. Yes. Another pause. You may decline, he said. I will accept. The answer arrived without hesitation. Volkov inclined his head slightly. Good. He closed the folder. Your schedule will adjust beginning Monday. Yes. You will receive orientation documents tomorrow morning. Yes. As she rose from the chair, he spoke once more. Miss Whitmore. She turned slightly. You did not know who I was when you chose to help. No. That is precisely why the decision matters. I understand. He studied her expression briefly. Some people perform kindness when observed, he said. Fewer maintain it when unnoticed. She inclined her head politely. I do not perform it. That is evident. As she reached the door, he added quietly, breathing should never depend on luck. No. Outside the study, Thomas Reeves waited beside the corridor window. Well? He asked calmly. I accepted. Thomas nodded once. That is efficient. Margaret looked up from the staff desk as Nina entered the room. Everything all right? Yes. Margaret noticed the document in Nina's hand but did not reach for it. Change often arrives quietly here, she said. Yes. Nina placed the folded paper carefully inside her notebook. Her watch still ran 2 minutes slow. For the first time, the difference no longer felt like delay. It felt like timing. Monday arrived with clear skies and a steadiness that felt earned rather than given. Nina stood at the small desk in the staff residence a few minutes before leaving for the main house, reviewing the printed orientation document Thomas had provided the evening before. The language was precise, efficient, free of unnecessary decoration. Responsibilities expanded. Reporting structure adjusted. Expectations clarified without exaggeration. The role carried weight, but not pressure. It suggested trust measured carefully over time. Her watch still ran 2 minutes slow. She fastened it around her wrist and stepped outside, the cool morning air carrying the quiet scent of damp earth and distant pine. Blackwood Estate appeared unchanged in the pale early light, yet Nina felt the subtle difference that came when a place began to feel familiar. The gravel path no longer seemed uncertain beneath her steps. The tall windows of the main house no longer suggested distance. The structure had become part of a rhythm she could recognize. Inside, Margaret greeted her with a small nod. Good morning, Miss Whitmore, she said, the formality softened by warmth. Good morning. Margaret poured coffee into 2 cups as she had done on Nina's first morning. But today the gesture carried quiet acknowledgement rather than simple courtesy. Change suits you, Margaret observed. I hope to suit the work, Nina replied. Margaret smiled. That is the correct priority. Mrs. Dalloway entered shortly afterward, holding a revised staff schedule. Beginning today, she said calmly. Miss Whitmore will oversee coordination between departments. All supply requests should be directed through her prior to submission. The announcement produced no visible reaction from the staff, but the atmosphere shifted subtly toward acceptance. In houses like this, adjustment occurred without unnecessary commentary. Nina inclined her head slightly. I appreciate the opportunity. Mrs. Dalloway studied her briefly. Opportunity is sustained by consistency. I understand. The morning passed with purposeful movement. Nina reviewed inventory reports, confirmed delivery schedules, and ensured that communication between departments remained clear and efficient. She noticed how small delays could create larger complications when not addressed promptly. Attention prevented friction. Precision prevented confusion. At mid-morning, Thomas Reeves requested a brief meeting in the West office. Your responsibilities will expand gradually, he said, handing her a tablet displaying the household coordination system. We avoid abrupt transitions. That allows continuity, Nina said. Yes. Thomas observed her for a moment. Mr. Volkov values stability and operational structure. I value clarity. That is compatible. He explained the communication channels between domestic staff, administrative personnel, and external service providers. The structure reflected careful design. Each detail allowed independence while maintaining oversight. Questions? Thomas asked. 1, Nina said. How long did the previous manager serve? Thomas considered briefly. 6 years. And why did the role become available? Retirement, he answered calmly. Nina accepted the explanation without further inquiry. Later that afternoon, she crossed paths with Alexander Volkov near the library corridor. He appeared stronger now, his posture steady, the subtle signs of recent illness fading into the background of composure. You've adapted quickly, he said. The systems here are well designed. They required adjustment. I prefer environments that improve. He regarded her for a moment. That is uncommon. It is practical. He nodded once. Your mother's treatment arrangements should proceed without delay, he added. Nina allowed the smallest pause before answering. Thank you. Health should not depend on uncertainty, he said. I agree. He moved past her toward the study, the conversation complete without need for elaboration. Margaret approached quietly afterward. He rarely discusses personal matters, she said. I noticed. Margaret gave a knowing nod. Consider that acknowledgement. As the day concluded, Nina reviewed the final coordination notes in the staff office, ensuring that each department had received updated schedules for the week. The process required patience but offered clarity. Before leaving, she opened her notebook and added a brief line beneath the entry she had written days earlier. Kindness has consequences. Today, she added, consequences become direction. Outside, the early evening light cast long shadows across the gravel drive. A car passed slowly beyond the iron gate, the world continuing its ordinary rhythm beyond the quiet structure of the estate. As Nina walked toward the staff residence, she noticed an elderly neighbor near the roadside struggling to lift 2 heavy grocery bags from the trunk of her car. The woman paused repeatedly, adjusting her grip, clearly determined but slowed by effort. Nina approached without hesitation. May I help you? She asked. That would be kind, the woman said with a grateful smile. Nina carried the bags to the front porch, placing them carefully beside the door. Thank you, the woman said warmly. People don't always stop anymore. Nina returned the smile gently. Sometimes they do. She continued down the path as the sky deepened into evening blue. Inside the estate behind her, lights began to appear one by one in the west wing. Work continued. Decisions continued. Life continued. Her watch remained 2 minutes slow, and for the first time, she understood that time had never been working against her. It had been allowing her to arrive exactly where she was needed. Justice had not announced itself loudly. It had simply opened a door, and she had walked through it without hesitation. This story reminds us that true character is revealed in quiet moments when no one is watching, and when doing the right thing comes at a personal cost. Nina did not help a stranger because she expected a reward. She helped because she believed that every life deserves dignity, regardless of status or circumstance. In a world where many decisions are driven by fear or convenience, the story teaches that integrity is not measured by success, but by the courage to act with compassion even when the outcome is uncertain. Silent justice often works slowly, but it recognizes those who remain faithful to their values. Kindness, when genuine, has a way of returning not always in the form we expect, but always in the form we need. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.